In 2021, a team of archaeologists excavating a dry lake bed in New Mexico found something that rewrote the textbooks before the paper was even published. Fossilized human footprints, pressed into ancient mud, and then preserved beneath layers of sediment, dated by the seeds embedded in the layers above and below them to between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. Not 15,000 years ago, not even 16,000 years ago, which was already considered bold by mainstream archaeology. 21,000 years ago, at the height of the last ice age, when the glaciers were at their maximum extent and the Bering Land Bridge had barely formed, human beings were already walking through what is now the White Sands National Park in New Mexico. The footprints told us they were there, the DNA told us who they were, and together, these two lines of evidence have dismantled the story of how the Americas were first settled more completely than any single discovery in the history of the field. The standard model had a clean narrative. Humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia to Alaska sometime after the glaciers retreated enough to open an ice-free corridor, roughly 13,000 to 15,000 years ago. They moved south rapidly, reached the tip of South America within a few thousand years, and in doing so completed the final chapter of the human colonization of the planet. The Clovis people, whose distinctive stone tools appear across North America starting around 13,000 years ago, were long assumed to be the first Americans, the descendants of the crossing, the founding population. The footprints in New Mexico are 8,000 years older than the oldest Clovis sites. Someone was in North America long before the story said anyone could have been there. The White Sands footprints were not the first evidence suggesting pre-Clovis human presence in the Americas. For decades, a series of sites had accumulated that seemed to push the date of American settlement further back. But each one was disputed. Each one had methodological problems that allowed skeptics to dismiss it. The Monte Verde site in southern Chile, excavated by Tom Dillahay beginning in the 1970s, showed evidence of human occupation dated to around 14,500 years ago, predating the Clovis horizon, and in a location so far south that it implied an entry into the Americas well before the ice-free corridor opened. It took 2 decades for the Monte Verde dates to gain mainstream acceptance. The Meadowcroft rock shelter in Pennsylvania showed occupation layers that some researchers dated to 16,000 years ago, though the dates remained contested. The Topper site in South Carolina produced artifacts from layers that could be interpreted as pre-Clovis, though the interpretation was disputed. The Pedra Furada site in Brazil contained rock art and burned material dated to over 40,000 years ago, dates so extreme that most mainstream archaeologists rejected them outright. What changed with the White Sands footprints was not just the age, it was the nature of the evidence. Footprints are not artifacts that can be displaced from their original context. They are not charcoal that can be contaminated. They are physical impressions in sediment, and the dating method used, optically stimulated luminescence, combined with radiocarbon dating of seeds embedded in the adjacent layers, was sufficiently robust to withstand the scrutiny that every pre-Clovis claim must survive. The scientific community accepted the White Sands dates in a way that previous pre-Clovis evidence had not been accepted, and the acceptance of those dates changed the question from were people in the Americas before Clovis to who were the people in the Americas before Clovis and how did they get there? The ancient DNA enters the story here, and what it reveals is simultaneously more complex and more interesting than the simple pre-Clovis question suggests. Beginning with the sequencing of the Anzac 1 individual in 2014, the Clovis child from Montana whose genome confirmed Native American ancestry for the Clovis people, and continuing through a series of increasingly comprehensive studies, researchers have been building a genomic picture of the first Americans that now spans from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego and from 15,000 years ago to the present. What this genomic picture shows is that the peopling of the Americas was not a single event. It was a series of migrations, some well documented and some still poorly understood, that brought multiple genetically distinct populations into the New World across a span of time that the White Sands footprints have now pushed back to at least 23,000 years before the present. The primary founding population of Native Americans, the one that the Anzac 1 genome and subsequent ancient DNA studies have characterized most thoroughly, appears to have diverged from Siberian populations approximately 25,000 years ago possibly during a period of geographic isolation in Beringia itself. This population, sometimes called the ancient Beringians or the first Americans in the genetic literature, was the source of the ancestry that virtually all indigenous peoples of the Americas share to varying degrees. Their genetic profile is distinct from any living Siberian population, consistent with a long period of isolation before the expansion into the Americas proper. But this founding population was not the only one. The ancient DNA record shows clear evidence of at least one additional population contributing to the ancestry of certain North American groups, the signal that researchers have called ancient North Eurasian ancestry, which connects Native American genomes to the ancient Siberian populations, whose genetic profile is also found in the ancestors of Western Eurasians. And in certain South American populations, particularly some Amazonian groups, there are signals of population Y ancestry that do not derive from the primary founding population at all, signals that point toward populations from Southeast Asia and the Pacific Rim as an additional source of ancestry for some early South Americans. The White Sands footprints belong to a period when none of this was supposed to be possible. At 21,000 to 23,000 years ago, the ice sheets were at or near their maximum extent. The ice-free corridor that the Standard Model proposed as the route from Alaska to the interior of North America did not exist. The corridor would not open until roughly 13,000 to 14,000 years ago, and even then, it took additional time for the biological resources, the plants and animals that any migrating human population would need, to colonize the newly opened land. The people at White Sands got there by a different route. The most plausible alternative, supported by both the genomic evidence and the archaeological record of Monteverde and other coastal sites, is the Kelp Highway hypothesis. The Pacific coastline of the Americas, from Alaska to the southern tip of South America, was bordered during the Ice Age by a productive marine ecosystem anchored on kelp forests. Populations of maritime hunter-gatherers, moving south along the coast and living off the rich marine resources of the Kelp Highway, could have reached the southern reaches of the continent relatively quickly, even while the interior was still glaciated and impassable. The White Sands footprints were made by people who had reached the interior of North America. They were not on the Pacific coast. They were in what is now New Mexico, well inland from any coastal route. This means that by 23,000 years ago, people had not only reached the Americas by some pre-Clovis route, but had already moved inland, adapted to the interior environment, and been living there long enough to leave multiple sets of footprints at a site that was, at the time, the muddy shore of an ancient lake. What did these people look like? Where exactly did they come from? And what happened to them? These are the questions that the DNA has been working to answer and that remain only partially resolved. The genomic evidence suggests that the pre-Clovis population, if it existed as a genetically distinct group separate from the main Clovis-associated founding population, may have left limited direct genetic descendants in any modern group. The Clovis-associated population and its descendants appear to have been the dominant demographic force in the post-glacial Americas, and if there were earlier populations with different genetic profiles, their signal has been largely diluted or overwritten in the modern and ancient DNA record. One exception may be in South America. The population Y signal detected in certain Amazonian populations, which does not trace to the standard Beringian founding population, could represent the genetic legacy of an early migration that preceded or accompanied the people who left the White Sands footprints. This signal remains contested, and its interpretation is actively debated among researchers, but its presence in the genomes of certain South American populations, combined with the now confirmed pre-Clovis presence in North America at 23,000 years ago, makes the picture of the first Americas considerably more complex than any single founding event model can accommodate. The footprints themselves are worth sitting with. There are dozens of them, pressed into what was then soft mud at the edge of an ancient lake, now preserved beneath layers of sediment in the New Mexico desert. Some of them belong to adults. Some of them belong to children. They are not marching in a straight line. They wander, turn, double back. They look like what footprints look like when people are going about the ordinary business of living near water. Not a purposeful migration southward. Not a survival march. Just people walking around near a lake, on a day 23,000 years ago, that they did not know would matter to anyone. The oldest footprints at the site belong to a young adult, probably a teenager. They walked to the lake and back. They are about the same size as a modern adolescent's feet. The person who made them was alive during the last ice age, at a time when mammoths and giant ground sloths still walked through North America, at a time when the genetic study of human prehistory was not even a concept that any human mind had formed. They left their footprints in the mud and went on with their life and eventually died, without knowing they were the first Americans, without knowing there was a question about who was first, without knowing anything about any of it except the lake in front of them and the day around them. The DNA has been working ever since to find them again. It has not yet found them fully, but the footprints say they were there, and the question of who they were, where they came from, and what happened to the people they eventually became is one of the most important questions that the ancient DNA revolution has not yet fully answered. The Paleo Indians were never what we thought, because what we thought was that we knew roughly when they arrived and roughly how. The footprints in New Mexico ended that certainty. The Americas were settled earlier than the textbooks said, by people whose complete genetic story we have not yet recovered, moving by routes we have not yet fully mapped, into a world that was still in the grip of the Ice Age. The last great frontier of human prehistory is not the Pacific. The Pacific has been settled, and its settlement has been genetically documented with increasing precision. The last great frontier is the Americas, before Clovis, the 10,000 years of human presence in the New World that the Standard Model said could not have happened, and that the footprints in the desert say absolutely did. The question of who these people were is not academic. They were the first humans to encounter the Americas as a world, to walk through its forests and cross its deserts, and stand at the edge of its rivers and decide to stay. Whatever they saw, whatever they knew, whatever they thought about the world they were moving through, it was a form of human knowledge and human experience that left almost no direct record except the footprints in the mud and the faint genomic echoes in certain South American populations whose ancestry does not quite fit any model anyone has built. We have been in the Americas for at least 23,000 years, perhaps longer. The evidence for earlier presence keeps accumulating, and the dates keep getting pushed back, and the Standard Model keeps absorbing the blows and adjusting. Someday, the full picture of who was in the Americas before Clovis will be assembled from footprints and genomes and the sediment record of ancient lakes. It has not yet been fully assembled. Someone was walking around a lake in New Mexico 23,000 years ago. Their footprints are still there. We are still trying to find the rest of them.